Hello again, and thanks for joining me for this final video in my making collage paper videos. This one's going to be all about creating beautiful texture and patterns using the gel plate and stencils. I also have these wallpaper samples that I ordered online that have texture on them, so I'm going to be trying those out as well. And I have some new stencils from joggles.com and some other of my older stencils that I may be trying again. And we're going to use those both on the Gelli Plate and just stamping them on paper to see the different effects that you can get with those. So let's get started with the Gelli Plate. Now I use Deli paper like I showed in the previous videos because it is 12 by 12 and it fits on my Gelli Plate perfectly. I'm going to start with some green. I believe this is the Chromium Oxide green. Again, I'm using Lucas paints. And this is my earth green or cascade green. I will double check and put it in the description below. So one's a lighter green, kind of a yellow green, and the other's more of a deep blue green. So when I was looking through my papers, I realized I probably need a little bit more in the green family to stock up my supply. So I'm going to be using green for part of these to sort of add more to that green bin that I have of green papers. So this is a wallpaper sample, and these are about, I think they're about 12 by 9. So I want to try a couple of different ones. You'll see there's what the texture looks like. It does absorb the paint quite a bit onto the sample, so it's a little bit hard to offset the paint that's on the sample onto a piece of paper. So really all I've been able to do is kind of put the texture pattern into the paint on a gel plate and then pull that off. It just dries too quick on the sample itself for me to get a good print. Maybe if the paint was a little bit thicker. For the Deli sheets, I generally put the dull side down. There's a shinier side and a dull side, and I try to make sure that I'm using the dull side just because I like that when I'm doing my collages, and so that there isn't a shine with other papers that I'm using that won't have a shine. And it's just as simple as sort of putting it on there, and you can either use a brayer or your hand just to kind of get all the paint rubbed on to the paper, and that pulled off pretty good. There's a little bit, you'll see there on the left, it probably dried a little bit, so it didn't quite pull that all up. The other thing with Deli paper is that it's not quite as absorbent as other papers. So if the stuff is dried out a little bit, it's going to have a hard, or it's really heavy, it's not going to absorb into the paper, so it's going to leave some of that on the gel plate. So here I'm actually going to add some iridescent. This is a Liquitex Basic color, and it's this white iridescent, so it's got a shiny, kind of sparkly effect to it. Now, it's not really spreading out the way I wanted it to. I wanted it to mix in with the green and have the green, kind of the whole green kind of shimmery, but it just kind of, it was so thick that it just made blobs. So I tried to roller those out the best I could. And then here's another Joggles stencil that I thought was really cool. So I've got that on there. I just gently lay it on there, grab my Deli paper, and I'm going to put this off-centered because the stencil isn't quite 12 by 12, so I can use that other side over there and add some more pattern on that some point here in the future. And I just rub it really good to get into those little grooves and crevices. So yeah, you'll see those white blobs there kind of are the shiny paint, but that's okay. So pull the stencil off, and we still got a whole nother print here, a nice positive print. And this looks like I just sprayed it a little bit just to keep it damp. So this looks like I grabbed a piece of actual rice paper instead of the Deli paper. It's a little bit more absorbent, so I find that if my paint's a little bit wetter, or sometimes if there's some left on the Gelli Plate and I spritz it or something, it sometimes activates it a little bit easier and soaks into the rice paper. You'll see here it like almost pulled it all off, which was great. So I'm just setting those aside to dry. And now I'm going to grab some yellow. And I clearly need to order some more paint. My bottles are starting to get empty. But I love that they're squeeze bottles to get the paint out, which is one of the reasons why I like the Lucas paint. The larger quantities of it come in those bottles with the little nose on it that you can squeeze out, and it's so much easier to keep that clean than the ones that snap closed. All right, so I've got some yellow here, and you'll notice I didn't clean off my Gelli Plate. I don't mind having extra stuff that sometimes gets picked up, and yellow and green are colors that work well together anyway. If it was something that didn't work well with the yellow, I might have cleaned it off. And I'm just going to grab that rice paper one that I'd already done and just do another, let's just do another print right over that. I love the layered look and things that look layered, which is why I use semi-transparent papers to do most of my to make most of my collage papers. But then you can also layer things on them when you're doing, when you're using the gel plate and stencils, or even mark making and doing multiple like layers on the papers themselves. All right, so I can pull that off. And let's see if we can get a positive print off of this. Sometimes that's called a ghost print, like a second print or a leftover print. I just call it a positive because with stencils, you're generally creating the sort of the negative first, right? And then you're pulling the positive. And again, you want to just make sure that you give it a good rub so that all that yummy paint that's still left on the gel plate gets transferred onto the surface of the paper or whatever you're putting it on. So here's another stencil. Again, I'm just going to use what's on my plate. This time I'm going to use blue. And this is probably, it looks like cyan blue. It's a pretty bright blue. And you'll see I'm not putting a ton of paint on. I'm keeping it, I just want a thin coat. If you put too much on, it just sort of smushes when you try to make the print. Now, I could stop just rollering right here and pull that print because that actually looks pretty cool right there. But that wasn't what I was, going for here. I wanted to use the stencil. But you could just put blobs of paint on there and roller it out sort of partially and make all sorts of interesting papers too. So here's the third stencil. This was also a joggle stencil that I got with the other ones. I got 4 of them. I don't think I used the 4th one in this video, but I wanted to try those 3 because I don't have any collage papers with those particular stencil patterns on. So I'm just going to grab that rice paper that I did that yellow sort of positive print on, where I pulled it off the Gelli Plate just with the last pull. And I'm going to do a print over that. And I'm hoping, because it's blue, that yellow, you'll see how it kind of makes it look green. It's definitely green where they sort of overlap. So now I'm actually kind of getting 3 colors in there. And I'm going to pull off the stencil here. And I'm going to grab the green one that I did. I have that edge left, so I thought I would just maybe clean off my Gelli Plate and use up, sections of those pages that I have left and just do some smaller sections of that pattern. Again, Deli paper. Looks like it has some of the white left in it, that shiny iridescent white. Because you'll see it left quite a bit on the Gelli plate. So now I'm actually going to go ahead and clean it off before I start the next print. So here's another stencil. And this time, rather than putting the paint on the Gelli plate, I'm actually going to put the stencil on it and paint over it. And I'm using a couple of different colors of red here. I'm using a lighter kind of orange red and that deeper, probably alizarin red. And I'm pushing pretty hard to get it down in there, in between those gaps in the stencil. So this is going to be a little bit heavier paint on the gel plate because I have to get it down in the crevices between those stencil patterns. And then I'm going to pull that off. Now this is pretty wet, so I can actually do a print off the stencil. But what I didn't do is sort of prepare ahead of time and stick a piece of paper over there. So I kind of grabbed one quickly here. And I believe that's a piece of rice paper. And I'm basically going to stamp this on there and just roller it down. Now, if you do this, you want to work fairly quickly because now my gel plate is actually drying. The paint on that is drying. And if it gets too dry, then you can't actually pull a print. The good thing here is that I put the paint on fairly thick because I had to get it in the grooves of the stencil. So it actually ends up being okay, but you do have to be a little bit quick when you're doing it this way. I also spritzed a little bit of water on the back side of that rice paper. So now I'm going to pull the paint off the gel plate with my stencil pattern in it. And the other pattern, I'm just leaving sit on the stencil. I'm just going to give it some time to hopefully absorb into that rice paper. So that's not too bad. It's still pretty solid, and it's quite bright. I don't use red a lot, so I thought I would create a few collage papers that were in the red family, and maybe try something with red in it. It's not a color that I use very often. I'm more of a sort of a landscape blue and green and sort of black and white kind of artist. So we'll see if I can find a place to add some pops of red in somewhere. And now I'm just using, a sheet that I had where I did that other stencil on part of it to just clean off as much of the extra paint as I can. The side over there didn't want to come off. It's already a little dry. And now I'm going to see if I can get this off my stencil here. Sometimes if your stencil is really, really delicate, this can be hard. You can start to rip your stencil. So fortunately, this wasn't too bad. But it didn't leave a super dark pattern, which is okay. I mean, it's just a nice variation. All right, so I have these two smaller. These are 6 by 6, and they're just basic grids with different size squares in them. I have all this red paint that I mixed up, so I want to use that up. So I'm going to use the same process here where I put the stencils on the Gelli plate and then actually sort of push the paint down in between in the patterns instead of inking it first and then pulling them up. And I'm also going to grab a piece of Deli paper here, I think, for this one. Oh, I decided to grab the piece that had a little bit left and just stamp what I could from the paint that's on the top of those. Try to use it all somewhere. Otherwise, I just end up sort of washing it all off. I've got a corner of a piece of paper somewhere, I'll try to stamp it on there. All right, so now we have to do what's left. Oh, so I grab a piece that I did that other half of the blue one on. Now I have some of the red on there from where I kind of cleaned up the plate, but I don't mind that there's some overlapping stuff there. It's okay. Just doing a quick check to see if it's getting pulled. And you'll see there was a spot there where there was a heavier blob of paint. So I can just fill that in a corner where I have some space. And that's kind of cool with that other pattern over there with the different mark on it. And again, I'm just sort of cleaning up as much of the paint as I can. So now I have another red one. All right, back to my yellow. And again, I didn't clean off my Gelli plate here because red and yellow mix okay, so I'm not really worried about it. What I wanted to do is try to do a little bit more work with the wallpaper samples to see if I could get some better patterns. Now the sample itself is pretty cool, but it's because of the thickness of it and the amount of texture it has, it would probably be really hard to glue down on a collage and not have it kind of be the main focus. So I'm just going to pick the rest of that up with the sort of the edge over the sort of edge that I did there. And it overlapped the red a little bit, and that's okay. Makes it a little bit more interesting. I'm just trying to get the bigger blobs of yellow off. It'll make a nice edge on a collage somewhere, I think. I also had these where I use my roller to sort of offload the color. They also make really interesting papers, so I save those and use those a lot. Here's another wallpaper sample. This one has a really, really fine pattern to it. It's almost like brush marks, but with little dots on it. So I sped this part of the video up because it's really quick. I just mixed up whatever red I had left with a little bit of white. So this gives me just a variation of that red. So I have some options. If I use red, I got some other options. I also have, I believe this could be burnt sienna, or it might be a deeper red. It's just a little bit darker color. So I'm just giving myself some variations of the red. So I have something to play with for collages. And then here's another pattern. This one's a little bit more organic. So I'm cleaning off my Brayer, and I'm going to switch back to green for this one. Now here, for these, I'm not using my Gelli plate. So if you have something that has some texture on it, like these wallpaper samples or anything else, you can just paint directly on them and then just put your paper on and rub it in just like you would on the Gelli plate. The thing about these wallpaper samples is that they do tend to soak up the paint a little bit, so the patterns don't really make a super solid imprint. But I do like the kind of broken patterns that it can make too, even. And you could always put the paint on a little bit thicker. So I just kind of finished up that corner that was open. All right, so now we're going to use up the green paint back on my Gelli plate. And I've got some other stencils here. these have a little bit more random kind of geometric patterns. And when you have these with these really small holes, you have to spend time kind of getting your fingers in all of those to get the pattern up. Which I didn't do there. So you'll see that the pattern's kind of broken here and there, which I like too, so that'll work. Now I've got enough stuff on my gel plate, it's really time to clean it off. So what you can do is either take white, I generally take white or an off-white, I think this is like sand or bone or something, that color, and just put a really, really thin layer over it, and what that does is it activates the paint that's still there. It kind of binds with it and reactivates it. And then I just put the deli paper on there and just leave it sit for a minute, you know, tidy up my workspace or wipe off my roller and just let it sit for a minute or two. And then you see when you pull it off, it actually pulls off, like everything comes up. It's awesome for cleaning off your Gelli plate. And it's another piece of collage paper. All right, so I thought I would try a metallic because I don't have any collage papers really that I've made that with the metallic colors. And I had a few that I went back and painted some metallic on, and I really liked the pop of the shine on there. So I thought I would actually just make some collage papers using my stencils. So I have some interesting patterns and use the metallics. So here I'm using actually a piece of deli paper and a piece of rice paper. And then I'm going to pick up the rest of that on that piece of rice paper. So I have a great little shiny section there that I can just add little pops of color to here and there if I need to, where it has a little bit of glimmer. And here I'm just spritzing some water on, because water on the Gelli plate tends to make the paint, you'll see it just kind of, it kind of made the paint spread apart, made these little bubbles of sort of air gaps and water gaps in there. And it creates a pattern. Now, it's not quite as pronounced with the metallics as it is with the regular acrylic paints, but you could see it a little bit there when it did it. So one of the things I discovered is I really love this indigo blue with that copper metallic color. So I thought I would clean up my plate with the metallic on it by adding some blue, like a nice dark color. And even that is beautiful. I mean, look at the layers on that Gelli plate. So I'm just going to kind of pull this all up. And again, this is really not a patterned or texture. You know, it's got some texture to it because you'll see the layers, but it's not really a patterned collage paper. So sometimes, you know, when you're creating the pattern ones, you're by default creating more solid ones, or, you know, just some that have a bunch of colors on them, but not specific patterns. But I loved this when I pulled it off. It was just, I loved the glimmer and that really dark, sort of dark blue. So now that those were all dry, I skipped forward here to these are dry now. So this is just going through the stack of all the dry ones that I did on the video here. So I've got some nice red ones. I've got this green floral pattern, which I really like. I'll have to separate out the red since I keep everything in containers based on color. And this blue I absolutely love and can't wait to use. The green worked pretty well too. The pattern seems to be a little bit more pronounced than it looked when I first pulled it. And then the one where I cleaned up my plate. And then there's this one where I just was rollering off, I was cleaning off the stencil, and it was just sort of soaking through and going onto the paper. And that actually created a cool pattern too. So I'm going to keep that as well and add to my stack.